You're listening to Big World Network.
Only One Was Lost, Episode 1, written by Edgar White, read by Amanda Mavison. Peter kicked open the door to the refinery, splintering the wood into 1,000 tiny fragments as he burst through the entryway. He paused, not exactly sure where he was supposed to go, and worried that he was already too late to be there anyway. Panic started to bubble to the surface. I need to find him. He hastily scanned the ground for any signs of his quarry before looking at the rest of the room. He had entered a reception area from the looks of it. Chairs were lined up against the walls, and a desk barred the entrance through the only door leading further into the refinery. He glanced at the ceiling and noticed that the light was still intact. He turned it on and listened with gratitude as it puckered and hummed to life. Well, he hasn't been here yet. He leapt over the desk and headed down a hallway, leading toward the back of the refinery. Peter quickly glanced into open doorways as he flew by them at a near run, hoping against hope that he still had time. No blood, no skins, no screams, no faces contorted in fear. He bumped into the wall and staggered slightly before stopping completely to catch his breath. I'm too afraid. This is never going to work. Horror-stricken, he placed his hand on the wall to prop himself up as the scene from last week flashed before him. Her head sat on the chair facing the doorway he had just come in, sitting in a pool of blood, mocking him, her mouth wide open in what must have been a last scream of fear, her eyelids removed. He shook his head and pushed himself off the wall. I don't have time for this. Mourn the dead later. Try and save the living now. He ignored the rooms that had lights on, passing by them without a glance. If he's already showing himself in the light, then I really am too late. And listened for any of the familiar noises that heralded his enemy's arrival. Can't hear anything but my heartbeat anyway. In and out of hallways he ran, zigzagging through what felt like the entire office section of the refinery. Each office was exactly the same as the one before it, and didn't help to register his location. I need to find him. I need to find him. This can't happen again. Not anymore. Head swimming from panic and fear, he stumbled through another door, expecting to find the same drab office, and found himself standing at the top of a staircase, leading him down to the production line. Shadows filled a majority of the room, sections of pure black that seemed to unnaturally push the light back. Peter's hair on the back of his neck stood up as he felt the eyes watching him from the darkness. He saw huddled shapes, shifting around, making no noise as they watched the newcomer with anticipation. He could feel their greed, feel their desire for blood, and hoped that he could find a way to stay in the light. He scanned for light sources, and aside from the one directly above him, there was only one other port of safety. Down the stairs and directly across the production line from him hung a solitary bulb with a chain. The bulb was next to a red exit sign over the back entrance to the refinery, and swung back and forth while flickering, casting a menacing light throughout the room. Was I wrong? Maybe he's not here after all. Either way, I need to make sure that no one is here still. Peter continued to survey the room from his vantage point, but at a much slower pace in order to get a better grasp of the exits, hazards, and potential hiding spots. He was just starting to head down the stairs when a man in a janitor's uniform burst out of the hallway a floor beneath him, and directly across the production line, clutching a mop to his chest as if it were a life preserver. Peter leapt down the stairs, taking them two at a time, and started to run as soon as he hit the bottom. He noted, as he ran full speed ahead, that the man had happened to stand in one of the only sources of light in the room, lucky him, which would be the best place in the room for Peter to make his stance against Thatcher, if it came to that, and lucky me. The man holding the mop turned to face the hallway he had just emerged from, bending over slightly to catch his breath. He seemed transfixed on the darkness, as if expecting something to burst out after him, while at the same time not really sure that he should be expecting anything at all. His eyes darted from the hallway to the shadows around it, and back again just as quickly. His breath came in quick, small gulps as he rubbed his hands on the handle of the mop and sporadically murmured to himself. Slowly, the man started to let the mop fall. "Get out of here!" The man in the janitor's uniform jerked his head to the sound of Peter's voice, raising the mop back to its defensive position, and then dropping it to the floor just as fast. His breathing became labored as he started panting heavily. "Stay with me, come on," Peter thought to himself. The man doubled over on his knees and emptied the contents of his stomach. He raised one arm and gestured toward the dark hallway that he had emerged from. That's when Peter heard it, and his heart sank. He was too late, and this was going to happen whether he liked it or not. He quickly crossed the rest of the room to where the janitor was, helped him stand up straight, and looked at the name on his shirt. "Mike." Peter grabbed his shoulders to turn him away from the hallway. "You really need to get out." "I saw it!" Mike yelled, his vocal cords free from the fear that was still in his wide-eyed expression. "I actually saw it," he said more to himself than to Peter. Peter could tell that this man was trying to convince himself that what he actually saw was real. "We're going to die, aren't we?" Mike started to cry. Well, apparently he's convinced himself of this impending doom, Peter thought. Peter roughly shook Mike's shoulders. "Get a hold of yourself and get out of here!" Peter turned him toward the exit and gave him a shove for good measure. Mike took a couple of steps, looked over his shoulder at Peter, possibly in gratitude or bewilderment, and then darted through the door into the warm summer's night and hopefully out to freedom. Only when the door latched shut and the unlucky janitor was finally out of harm's way did Peter allow himself to turn back toward the dark hallway and face what was lurking there. He already knew what it was, or better yet, who, and that he was not prepared to face it. He would most likely die here tonight, but at least he might be able to slow the thing down. Somehow. Maybe. Placing his full attention on the noise brought back unwanted memories of when he had heard it before, and it bothered him just as much now as it had back then. "She must not have been willing to look him in the eye at the end," Rufus said casually as he looked at the head on the chair. How he could ever analyze a scene like this while remaining completely detached, Peter never knew. Peter tore his gaze away from the horrific scene, only to find something far worse sitting in the corner of the room. The darkness gave it no shape to tell of. Honestly, at first it just looked like a small, bunched-up blanket. But there was a pool forming at its edge. "Is that skin?" Peter asked. "Is that a pile of—" Peter shook his head again to try and physically remove himself from that memory. This is not the time. But doing so just brought back the noise from the hallway into full focus again. He had tried to describe the noise to Maria before, but always to no avail. Every time he tried to remember it, the noise became muted and distorted, but now, facing it once again, he would be able to clearly describe it to her, if he ever saw her again. Besides, he had never told her it was a demon he was describing, but always some type of old car he just couldn't place. I don't know why I expected her to care with that type of explanation. It sounded like an old man shuffling his feet slowly along a carpeted floor behind his walker, except that the walker was made of solid granite and made a loud thunk every time it was placed down. Either that or a heavy-footed ogre dragging a body behind him as he walked. Both explanations sufficed, and Peter smiled to himself in spite of the situation. The noise was coupled with the crackling of wood in a fire and tree branches scraping across glass. As the noise got closer, Peter could hear the raspy breathing he had been expecting, that carried with it a faint echo of children's laughter. He steeled himself against the fear brewing within him, knowing that this particular entity thrived on fear, and he spoke to the darkness. "Come on out, Thatcher!" No more old man walking, no more branches on glass, no more crackling wood, just raspy breathing that started to quicken with excitement. He recognized my voice, Peter thought in surprise. "It's just me and you now." The sounds came back in a flurry of noise as Thatcher quickly closed the distance between himself and Peter, stopping just short of the light and crouching at the edge of the darkness. He stood where he knew a vague silhouette could still be seen, enough to invoke fear in the unprepared. A hideous gargoyle wing protruded from the shoulder blade of the crouching figure and slowly flexed in the dark. Dark, scaly skin covered a body that was glowing faintly red, and a set of talons were in place where a foot should have been. Thatcher stretched his hand out into the light, revealing a normal-looking hand that ended in long, sharp claws in place of fingertips. He pointed at Peter, turned his hand over and curled the fingers toward himself repeatedly as he said, "Come here, Peter. Let's play." Peter did everything he could to not swallow, and said with a surprisingly calm voice, "Why are you transformed?" The raspy breathing turned to guttural laughter, and in a high-pitched voice Thatcher responded, "Oh, I'm sorry, Peter. I'm not myself." Then, in much darker tones, "Let me put on my face." Bones cracked and skin stretched and tore apart as Thatcher started to transform. Even in the darkness, Peter could tell from the noise that this was a hideously painful process. A clawed hand darted out into the light again, this time writhing in pain, reaching for anything that might bring it comfort. Finding none, it slammed into the cement, creating long sets of slashes as he screamed in the darkness. 3 separate streams of blood trickled along the floor, pooling a couple of feet away from where Peter stood. He spared a glance for the blood, and saw that it looked like liquefied tar, and gave off no reflection. He had never been present for a transformation before, and had no idea if this was going the way it should, or if he would end up lucky tonight and get out of there alive. The screams continued to rend the night air as Peter looked back toward the door the janitor had escaped through and contemplated trying to make a run for it himself. He discarded the thought as quickly as it had come to him, though. He'd just catch up with me, kill me, and then probably go after Mike anyway. No, this is as good a place as any. He tore his gaze reluctantly from the door. And maybe I can buy that unlucky janitor some time. 2 more deafening cracks made the ground shudder, and then there was nothing. Just silence. Peter waited, but honestly didn't know what he was waiting for. The blood was still trickling out of the darkness, but there was no other motion or noise. Could he really be that lucky? Did the great demon Thatcher actually mess up a transformation and kill himself? Maybe Peter would get home to his wife tonight, and this whole mess would be behind him. Should he check the body? He looked into the darkness and decided to forego that option. He turned back to the door and started to walk. His pace quickened the further he got from the darkness behind him. Almost there, just a couple more steps. Almost free. Peter. Calm. Oh, so calm. Going somewhere? Nope. He knew it had been too much to hope for. He let out the breath he didn't know he had been holding, dropped his outstretched arm that had been reaching for the doorknob, and turned around to face this new, more human voice. Thatcher had emerged from the darkness, and now stood next to the pool of blood, almost exactly where Peter had been a couple of seconds before. He was picking bits of rock from his palm and flicking them into the pool of blood at his feet. As always, Peter was surprised by how normal Thatcher looked when he was a man. He was of average height, with dark black hair and brilliant blue eyes. He had a medium build, going so far as to even have a slight pot-belly. "A bit theatrical, don't you think?" Peter asked. Thatcher had apparently been wearing a dress suit before the transformation, because half of it was still completely intact on the left side of his body. The right side was in tatters, with only small portions remaining. He almost looks like Two-Face. Thatcher paused mid-flick and glanced down at his destroyed outfit. He picked off a few pieces of lint, casting them aside, and grimaced from pain as he took a step toward Peter. "Don't make the mistake of assuming I'm not dangerous in this form. Even you're smarter than that." Peter pointed at the remnants of Thatcher's suit, trying desperately to do anything that would keep Thatcher from moving closer to him and buy him some time. Thatcher looked down and smiled. "Oh, thank you for noticing. I only transformed half of my body this time. It's incredibly painful to do so, and took me quite a while to learn how to actually do it. But Peter, you should hear how they scream in absolute terror." He had been steadily drawing closer to Peter as he explained, leaving him mere inches from Peter's face. His eyes are just a pure frenzy of rage, Peter thought in surprise. Thatcher gestured back at the vomit in the center of the pool of light and giggled. Did I make him do that? Or was it the running, do you think? Thatcher was almost giddy as he contemplated out loud. Granted, he wasn't in very good shape, but I think I might have scared his dinner out of him. He looked back at the putrid pile almost fondly, before rounding on Peter and waggling his finger in the air at him. "What are you doing here, Peter?" he asked in the way an overdoting mother would ask a toddler that had somehow gotten into the bottom of the pantry. He paused to wait for an answer, looking around the room as if he didn't really care. "You know you're breaking the rules," he said offhandedly as he started to pace, very slowly. His fingers stayed raised in the air as he paced, assuming a lecturer's mannerisms. "Consequences must follow as they always do, at least according to your scribe." He glanced around the room, acting as if he was noticing for the first time. "Wait! Where is your scribe? And the guardian, where is he? Are you telling me that you've brought no one here to help you? That you've come to face me all by yourself?" He glanced over at Peter, saw nothing to indicate whether his statement was true or false, then continued, "Because if that's true, then I have a newfound respect for you." He laughed, looked over at Peter, then laughed again. He suddenly became very serious, and stopped his pacing directly in front of Peter. He turned, placing their faces inches away from each other once again. "Do you remember when I made you do that?" he said maliciously as he gestured toward the pool of light. "It really wasn't that long ago." "How can that all be skin?" Peter stood up from where he had been doubled over and wiped his mouth. "Are you afraid, Peter? Because you should be." Peter stood as still as possible throughout this monologue, hoping that he wouldn't do anything to give away his plan, however feeble it was. He suspected from what he knew of Thatcher that he was growing bored. He had been taught that Thatcher always did when fear was not being shown, or his subject was not being cooperative. Thatcher eyed Peter disdainfully, looking him up and down in abject disgust. "You're not even worth my time." He turned around, raised his arms, and tilted his head back, yelling, "Let's get this party started!" It was the opening Peter had been waiting for. He brandished a knife from underneath his shirt and tried to sink it deep within Thatcher's rib cage. But apparently Thatcher knew the attack was coming, because he nimbly dodged to the side, turned in the air, and knocked the knife from Peter's hand. He shook his head. "Peter, how many rules are you planning on breaking tonight? We at least need to wait for our guests to arrive." He kicked the knife further into the darkness as he mumbled something to himself about the blatant lack of true gentlemen in the world today. Peter heard them long before he saw them, lots of old men brushing branches on glass, coming down the hall. They spilled out of the hallway opening and stood at the edge of the light. He had never seen so many in one place. Actually, he had only ever run into one or two at a time, and there had to be at least 50 in this small refinery. He looked around, and was surprised at how different they all were. Some had wings where others had none, and some were almost human-looking except for long, bull-like horns. They were all sorts of skin colors, hair colors, heights, and weights. A few were able to generate fire with their hands or breath, and were in the process of creating a ring of fire around Thatcher and Peter. "Here we go," Peter thought. "This is the end." Another demon brought forward a rack of weapons, all medieval in nature, swords, maces, shields, bows, and a few other instruments of death that Peter didn't even recognize. "You know, we could just get some guns and get this over with quickly," Peter yelled over the roar of the flames and the overexcitable crowd. Thatcher looked absolutely appalled at the suggestion. "Yes, Peter, but where's the fun in that?" He smiled, then bowed. "Because of the gentleman that I am, and apparently that you are not, I will allow you to choose first." Peter stalked over to the weapons rack, more quickly than he had intended, and grabbed a sword and shield. "Well, if we're going to do this medieval style, then we might as well do it properly." He hoped his voice wasn't as shaky as he felt. Thatcher grinned. "Now there's a good lad." He casually strolled over to the rack and began to try out some new weapons, half as if he had never seen a weapon before, and the other half as if he were picking out a new Sunday suit to replace the tatters he now wore. Too heavy. A two-handed sword fell to the ground. Too useless. Down went the crossbow. Too easy. He glanced at Peter as he discarded the Morning Star. Thatcher mockingly threw up his hands and said, "There is simply nothing decent to be had here." A grunt came from the darkness, and a beautiful broadsword skittered into view. The leather-bound golden hilt sparkled in the faint light, the silver hue of the blade gleaming. Thatcher hefted the sword with ease and examined it. "Now, where did this wonderful surprise come from?" he asked the crowd around him. They responded with jeers, hoots, and applause, but quieted quickly when Thatcher whipped around to face his opponent. "Now, it's time to have some fun."
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.